hello everyone. On behalf of Art Consulting Tool, Lelong, PPOW, I would like to thank you for making time for us today. I'm João Paulo Siqueira Lopes, an art advisor and cultural producer based in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Firstly, I would like to thank Maria Constanza Heinz from Lelong, who organized the panel with us, and the panelists, Sabine Breitwieser, Mary Sabbatino, and Wendy Olsoff. Before continuing, it is crucial to approach this subject, so I would also like to thank health professionals in Brazil, as we're currently going through the peak of the pandemic here in the country, as well as health professionals in the world who are bravely dedicating their lives to others in these tough times. It is a pleasure to be here talking about these two seminal artists, Anna Mendieta, whose state is represented by Lelong, and Carolee Schneemann, whose state is co-represented by PPOW and Lelong. The online exhibition, Irrigation Veins, we can see some images on Zoom right now, aims to explore both artists' parallel histories, iconographies, and shared affinities for ancient forms and nature. Although Anna Mendieta and Carolee were part of many group shows, it is the first time the two artists have been shown together in a direct dialogue. And it's an exhibition Schneemann proposed during the last year of her life in 2018. The panel today will examine the exhibition, and will also approach galleries' relationships and histories and overlapping themes in the oeuvres of both artists. On a personal note, and also thanking Sabine here for one of the most remarkable moments of my life, I have seen the Carolee Schneemann show at MoMA PS1, and it was undoubtedly one of the best, most complete, and nicely curated shows I've ever seen in my life.
Thank you.
I wanted to put that. And as per Anna, a part of seeing her works in various museums' collections, I had the chance to see the show Mary also conceived, covered in time and history.
No, I didn't conceive it. It was conceived by the Catherine Nash Gallery in Minnesota.
With your help, right?
Well, I did not conceive it.
At Show the Poem in Paris in 2018.
Oh.
And this was the occasion for me to discover many film works I didn't know yet. We will speak about them lately. So for those who don't know us, Art Consulting Tool's mission is not only to establish a well-informed collective base, but we also work developing ambitious curatorial projects such as artists' books and exhibitions. So to let you all know, the panel has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube channels of ACT, Lelong, and PPOW. I will now introduce the first panelist. So Sabine Breitwieser, if I'm saying correctly.
Perfect. Sounds very Austrian.
I had a few years of German in school.
Happy League, huh?
Is an international curator and museum director who has curated important exhibitions on the two artists. So from 2013 to 2018, she held the position of director of the Museum der Moderne in Salzburg, Austria. And during her tenure, in 2014, she collaborated with Hayward Gallery in London to organize and present the retrospective Anna Mendieta Traces. In 2015, the exhibition that I just spoke about, it was to date the largest retrospective on Carolee Schneemann, kinetic painting, and it was shown at the Museum für Modern Kunst in Frankfurt and the MoMA PS1 in New York.
And if I may interrupt, it was first shown in Salzburg, actually, before I traveled to Frankfurt.
Okay, exactly.
But don't worry.
The museum you were directing.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so just for everyone to get a better sense, to date, Sabine has organized more than 150 monographic and thematic exhibitions throughout Europe and United States, and edited and published more than 100 catalogs and books. So Sabine will give us an introduction on the biography of both Anna Mendieta and Carolee Schneemann, and I will follow with some questions.
Okay, thank you, João, and thanks to Mary and Wendy, my longtime collaborators in both artists, for inviting me to join this panel on quite a short notice, but I think we'll do our best. So, and we're all very experienced in Zoom now, but I hope it will be a lively discussion with you. I'm really looking forward. So, I mean, Anna Mendieta and Carolee Schneemann, these are two artists I admire highly, and I had really the great pleasure to work several times actually with both artists in group shows and solo shows, and I guess in particular with Carolee Schneemann also important acquisitions for a number of museums. So let's start with Anna, the youngest artist, but also the artist who died tragically under very controversial circumstances, as a lot of you might know early on. So she was born in Cuba, in Havana, as most of you will know, people who are listening, or certainly the panelists, in 1948. And she grew up in a politically very engaged family, actually. And during the rise of the Cuban Revolution, her parents decided to send her and her sister Raqueline to the United States. Anna was only 12 years old at that time. So she was sent without her parents, with an organization to Miami, where she grew up in fostered childcare. But early on, she decided to study art, to become an artist at the University of Iowa. She started with painting, and then she enrolled a very important class, intermediate art was the program called, intermediate program, with a original German artist, Hans Breder, who was very influential actually, and who I think really the program was very, very important for her. And she finished it also, of course, with an MFA. She, in the 70s, when Breder became also her life partner, at that time she started her first travels to Mexico, to Europe, and started to do work there out in the field, out in nature, actually. This is what she was interested in. And in a very particular way, I must say. She inserted more or less her body, to put it out very simplifying, in nature to create what she called a dialogue with the female mythological body in nature, or the earth. And the earth she understood as a goddess, so as something very sort of fundamental in her work. So her body became part of her work. But interestingly enough, and I think we'll speak about that in connection with Carolee Schneemann, all these actions or performances, as we would call it, and the Mendieta would refuse all these sort of categories, were done in private, just for herself and for the person who took the photographs or the films. And those materials, the documents or whatever you would call it, would be publicly available in gallery. But the actions or the live performances were never public. So speaking already about what makes her work distinct from Carolee, in fact. Not all of Carolee. Carolee also did private performances also. So later on, she kind of followed up this idea of silhouettes, and from the 80s on, to make it very short, to cut it very short, she disappeared out of her artwork. Her body was not visible anymore. The body was represented by a silhouette, what she called it, of her body. She also moved to New York when she broke up with Hans Breder actually in the late 70s, which was of course very important to her to dive into the very lively art scene there in the late 70s. And of course was all these movements of the 70s, outgoing from the 60s, conceptual art, land art, all these things became, had an impact on her, although she really objected, in particular to what the land artists did, because she felt like this was rather an abuse of nature than something of celebrating nature, celebrating the land, and she felt she wanted to go for a more anti-modern, anti-postmodern approach, as she would call it. So something very different as someone like Bob Smithson would do, for instance. She got also a very important award in the 80s. Actually, going back to New York, there she met Carl Andre, who became her husband, as we all know, the famous minimalist artist, who, yeah, well, maybe Mary want to speak about that a little bit more, about this private relationship. She got a very important award, the Prix of Rome, and moved to Rome for 2 years, where she also started very, very different work. And in her late years, although she was still young because she died in 85, she was not even 40 years, really in a tragic accident, let's call it like that. She, in the last years, she did a lot of drawings and sculptures, very, I would say, that's what she always understood herself as a sculptress, I would say, from the very beginning, even she was trained as a painter. So Anna Mendietta's death had a huge impact on the art scene, in particular on the women artists who, for certain reasons, objected very much under the sort of regarding the circumstances and the investigation of this accident. And she became very, very influential. She showed, of course, she did important shows during her life, but she's one of those artists that really major recognition came posthumous, I would say. Maybe that's what happens to a lot of women artists. Yeah. And maybe this leads us to Carolee Schneemann, who I had the privilege to work with her during Lifetime for quite some time. So that's an artist, Anna Mendieta. I showed already in 2000 in an exhibition in Vienna at the Generali Foundation, which was called Vivencias, by the way. Carolee I knew since the 80s, since the late 80s actually, and I started to work with her actually when I moved to New York to work at MoMA in 2010, actively work with her. So Carolee is quite a bit older, so she was born officially in 39, maybe a little bit earlier. That's something which has still to be announced or clearly investigated, actually. She was born in the US, in Pennsylvania. Her father was a physician, and Carolee was early on interested being an artist. As she would put it in her words, she said, and I'm looking to my notes now, which I always laughed, this quote of her, I was drawing before I could speak. Yeah. So she had this very immediate understanding, access to fine arts, to arts. And she studied art at Bard College on a scholarship, actually, very prominent scholarship, where she had some troubles. The way she worked as a woman artist, actually moved on to Columbia and then made also her master at the University of Illinois. And she is, like Anna Mendieta, trained as a painter, in particular trained, and she was very keen on highlighting this very often as a landscape and portrait painter, actually. And painting, even all of us will think about performance art, media art, when we think about Carolee's work. Painting was her primary artistic medium from the beginning until the end of her career. And she's one of those artists who always understood whatever she did, looked at it under the notion of a painting, of an expanded painting, a painting where she went off the canvas, as she would say. I liked, and I think this was maybe the interesting aspect and the very much appreciated aspect, how I looked at Carolee's work. I looked at Carolee's work as a genealogy of painting. Started, of course, with her early works, painting, then moving on to assemblage, including everyday objects, a lot of very special techniques she invented. She used, for instance, fire as a sort of creative process. She used kinetic, as a motorized objects. She used historic references by photographies and all kinds of things. So her early works a lot about researching her role as a woman artist in art history, and what her potential perspectives are, because she understood early on that it's quite hard out there as a woman artist, actually. So so she had all these, so she had to face all these sort of resistance or lack of recognition or seriosity, being taken serious as a student, as a painting student already. She was facing those things. So, and she created something with this assemblage, what she called painting constructions, actually. So I think it's quite obvious here. She works with the notion of painting as something she constructs, so which is not a given medium, a flat medium, like in modernist terms. So that's something maybe they share, this going against modernist issues or expectation in fine arts. And in the 60s onwards, when she also moved to New York, she was, of course, a very important part of the emerging New York downtown art scene, with happenings and events, and she became a very popular model or performer, performing components, I would rather say, because there she was not a subject, but rather an object for people like Oldenburg or Warhol. And she decided to become a subject, of course, of her work. Not only a subject, but also the observing object. I will speak about this later. So she expanded her artistic practice by using dance, using choreography, all kinds of body, her body, of course, performance-based components in her art, and really expanded her work. She already did her first performances in the 60s, actually, and on the contrary to Anna Mendieta, she also did private performance, a very important one, Eye Body, which ended up in a sequence of photographic images. So similar to Anna Mendieta, but unlike Anna, Eye Body was staged in her studio in the midst of all her painting constructions of that time, where she wanted to become part of this painting construction, as she called it, as a live element. So unlike and she had an artist there, Arrow, actually, who took the photographs she later publicized. But soon she went on to undertake and create really a number of choreographies and performances. Unlike Anna Mendieta, in public or in front of the public. She was a co-founder of Judson Church Dance, was the first, long time only visual artist doing choreographies there. So she really expanded her work and became very, very important for her performance-based work, and expanded at the same time. And that's interesting, and that's also they share, but also I think it's quite distinct how both use the media. Expanded it not only into photography, but also into film, experimental film. She has sort of, I would say, Carolee Schneemann has many faces, actually, because she's also an important writer, but also an painter and performance artist and feminist, but also an important experimental structural filmmaker in some ways. So this is another side pass. And she created something what she called kinetic theater. This was sort of the red thread I took when I called the show Kinetic Painting, because I'd like to highlight this notion of painting. Carolee was kind of attempting to create and develop in her work. And in these very beautiful, I really have to congratulate to Mary and Wendy for this amazing idea. I had no idea actually this was a wish of Carolee to show with Anna, but I know she was very keen on Anna and very taken about the early death of Anna. And she even did a piece on Anna Mendieta and was very engaged in this discussion about the life of Anna and also her role in the art world. She where was I? I lost my red line. So she developed this idea of the kinetic theater, which is a very specific term Carolee used for a number of works, not only literal performance-based works, but also kind of structurally kinetic works. And in the exhibition is one of is a work, or the sketch, as Carolee called it. I think one of the most important works is in this beautiful internet exhibition, up to and including limits, up to and including her limits, actually, where she got inspired by her tree surgeon who used a rope to suspend from the tree to cut the broken twigs of the tree, branches of the tree. And she just experimented with it and loved the sort of notion of having no gravity, losing, you're floating in the sky. This is something actually she started already earlier in the 60s with some works. So here we could look at the sort of connection in terms of sculpture, because sculpture is a lot about gravity. And since Anna Mendieta, we could consider as a sculptress, and I think there are a lot of connections also with Carolee about this idea of sculpture. So, and I think what is interesting also is that both Anna and Carolee created kind of iconic works, and for a long time, in particular for Carolee, her work stood for very few artworks, her entire work, and people didn't look deeper or gave her work a wider perspective or angle. And I think this was probably, luckily, it seems, the success of this exhibition. I had the privilege to still develop with Carolee at lifetime. And I must say, I miss her a lot. I never had the chance to meet Anna. I'm sure we would have got along very well. Yes, just yesterday an image popped up. I had dessert with Carolee in Frankfurt. One of those in social media, the image is 3 years ago. So Carolee was sitting in front of me with the little tiny, beautiful cakes. And I thought, oh my God. Yeah, unfortunately, Carolee passed also, is not with us anymore, but her work is alive. And luckily, we have this situation now that people, I think, look in a different way at her work. And I even have a show up right now. It's open also in the beautiful Engadin in Switzerland, Museum Susch, where I organized a show about the influence of Carolee Schneemann in the younger generation. And I'm lending the title of her work up to and including limits after Carolee Schneemann, with artists like Pipilo de Rist and Sarah Lucas, Andrea Fraser, many more. And yeah, so I think Carolee, both artists have a huge influence in the generation after them. And further on, when I talk, I'm often approached nearly every week by younger artists or students who want to know more about, who try to get hold of the catalogs of the book. And yeah, and luckily I could organize this show. As you mentioned, Traces by Anna Mendieta was co-organized with Hayward Gallery and chief curator Stephanie Rosenthal, who did an amazing job. And it traveled later on to Prague. And yeah, so I think it's of course fantastic to have the opportunity to dive into an artist's work, to have all these fantastic works on view, because that's one of the greatest privilege. When you're organizing an exhibition, you're not only visiting it, you're very close to your work, you have the chance to study, to research, and so it becomes like a part of your life. I would say, like of Wendy and Mary, certainly for many, many years, both artists, right, are part of your lives. Yeah.
So Sabine, in order to understand the intersections in Mendieta's and Schneemann's works, it is important to emphasize some clear differences. I was wondering if you can please explore them a little more.
Yeah, I mentioned some already. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people at first sight think, these are the body artists from the 60s, 70s onwards, and a lot of people don't look carefully or don't really research enough. And I thought about it again, and I think it's interesting because the role of media is certainly very important in both artists, and of course also the using the body and the photographic image of a live action. But I think there are clear differences because, as I mentioned before, Carolee Schneemann understood herself, all her works, as painting, as something which comes out of painting, and you can see this clearly how she paints. There's no video document of Carolee Schneemann. She paints on it, she colors it, so she doesn't believe in the document as such, for instance. So that's for instance, I think a clear difference. And she always relates also to the exploration of the body and its histories, for instance, in sort of the history of the woman. This is very specific for Carolee, and she was very interested early on in this sort of, I would call it the traveling of media. So in particular, this work we were talking about, up to and including limits, she wrote a very interesting text that really intrigued me, and this was sort of where I thought, I have to acquire it for the Museum of Modern Art, in particular of sort of the statement of the artist, because early on she asked herself, how many video monitors will a performance require? I really summarize it, I simplify it now, in order to be part of a museum collection. So in order to become part of the history of, because she realized live performances are ephemeral, of course, and also every performance is different because it's live. And she was interested early on to work on these sort of different faces and different articulation and formulations, because each viewer, of course, sees each performance different than another viewer. So she was very interested on these different angles. And in particular, this performance, what we call now a performance media installation or video installation, she performed, I don't know how often, 7 or 8 times. We researched it, ended up in a video installation. Early on, she kept adding and adding by showing these papers. She did the drawings, just you showed the image. I mean, maybe you can show it again, where she was suspending herself from a harness in a sort of corner situation she laid out with paper and marked in connection of her arms, how long they reached, and was shaking up there. And so it was a real physical interaction, but a really durational piece, because it's not something she did like a theater piece for an hour. She did it 4 hours, so like 8 hours a day or whatever. So it was really related to exhaustion, how she responded to the audience. It was an hours long piece in front of the audience. And this ended in a video installation, having also the drawings, but also the harness, the empty film projector. She was sort of, there was a spotlight of a film projector without the film. So this is very specific of Carolee, her interest in the representation or the translation of live performances ending up in a sort of media representation. While Anna Mendieta, on the other hand, first, she didn't want to be assigned to any specific category. She really objected that. That was very specific to her. And she used the body, but she never performed live. I hope I'm right, Mary. You have to correct me. I don't recall.
Well,
early on only.
Some actions were done in front of others.
Yeah.
I like for example, when she did body tracks, that was always done in front of people. There are a couple of others. One, the death of a chicken, or chicken piece, I'm sorry. But as predominantly, you are correct that they were private actions, and then the photograph was the way in which the photograph was the way in which she communicated the action after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think the interaction with the audience, which seemed important to Carolee, though she did many private, did not seem to be the same urgency.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm right, but I have a little bit the impression that Carolee was really interested in the interaction with the public, while Anna Mendieta was more interested to interact with nature somehow.
She worked at Franklin Furnace, she did do performances, but the majority, we understand via her films and her photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, one could argue that Anna Mendieta was more interested to create new media. If she was so against being assigned to any category like land art, performance art, conceptual art, and she really tried to do her own thing, to develop her own thing out from her sort of search for an identity, for her place, this sort of feeling of exile and reconfiguration in a country, which became even more important as older she was somehow, because it became even more important. That this is very particular, while Carolee was more interested to engage in painting as such. Even she used electronic media and all kinds of things. So this notion with categories and media, I think, is different. And I think it makes a difference if you're thinking about painting, if you do a performance, or if you're thinking about you want to do something new, you don't want to be assigned something, you're more interested in a dialogue.
I think a good word to think of her work is synthesis.
Yeah.
That she tried to bring almost unconsciously different ideas that were percolating in art, whether it was land art, whether it was feminism, even though she had an ambivalent relationship with that. I think it's synthesis. And I think that's why her work is new, even now, to people. People discover it and they think she's alive and the work was just done yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I think she was carefully, obviously that's part of her work, working on this mise en scène, on her settings, how she inserted her body or the traces of her body. That was very important. Even so far that, and that's maybe she shares also with Carolee when it comes to the photographic representation of her action, she carefully selected, that's what was beautifully shown in Traces in the archive section we had, she carefully selected the excerpt of the image, which would later, or in the gallery or museum context, represent the action, the former action through a photographic image, right?
Sometimes, not always. Sometimes she did, indeed. But that's a huge discussion for another day. And I'm interested to hear from Wendy about, Carol. You knew Carolee longer and better than any of us.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, she had many private performances as well. I was just thinking it through while you were speaking. But she obviously did more performances with audiences than Anna did. But she, I'm just forgetting that, she had pieces with her cat every morning. It's called
right.
She did a lot of filming on the piece she did for Anna was on her own. I mean, she sometimes had someone there like Arrow to photograph it, but these were not public performances at all. But then of course you have Meet Joy and up to including Her Limits, which is for audiences, but smaller than you think probably when you were doing your performances in the 60s or 70s. It wasn't like probably huge crowds either. It's a whole very different idea. And she never wanted to be called a performance artist. So she too was sort of by calling herself a painter, refused to be categorized in any of these other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think both had an impact of, now speaking from Vienna actionism or Vienna actionism, but objected to it, of course. I mean, Hans Otto Mühl was teaching in Iowa. I had the opportunity still when I did Vivencias in 2000. I phoned quite often with Hans Breder, by the way, because I didn't really know. And I looked at Anna Mendieta's piece and I thought, this looks like Vienna actionism, but the main protagonist and the director of the mise en scène is a woman and is not a male artist. And then he told me, yeah, actually Otto Mühl was teaching there, and I think even Bruce came once. And I know from Carolee, she also went to the Friedrichshof once, and she knew, of course, and was, you know, involved in exhibitions, but they, of course, had a very different understanding of a woman being engaged in an action and appearing on a photograph, because certainly what Carolee said, she wanted to be the image and the image maker in iBody. This was her sort of leading principle, one could say, a feminist principle, of course. But I think what I don't know how familiar you are, but a lot of the actions of the Vienna actionists were staged also. I mean, even there were public, there was no public, but sometimes they couldn't do it in public because the police would have closed it or whatever. But they really controlled the image. They hired the photographers and they highly controlled the image, also cropping and worked very actively with the images, sent out images before actions or former actions and things like that. So this also as a propaganda material in some way. And I think they learned that, and also they could find their own very distinct way of working with actions and the photographic record or artwork deriving out of the generating from the action they decided to release. I think that's where they have sort of, they're different, but also that's something they share, I would say. What do you think, Mary, with Anna? You're sort of really the expert. There are sort of, we know their prints. There, of course, there's this huge number of 35 millimeter slides, because what I understand, Anna,
Thousands.
Yeah, Hans Breder took a lot of the early actions, of course, the photograph.
Not so many, some, it's true. But
Yeah.
I guess what is, you know, for me, when I started working with Mendieta, my attraction was seeing all the slides, you know, because I'm not sure if it was you or Wendy, someone said these artists were known primarily by just a few images, you know, with Mendieta. With Carolee, it's often up to including her limits or meat joy. With Mendieta, it's usually the tree of life or the one with her with flowers. So we make our understanding of their work based on a very small amount. And when Jacqueline Mendieta and a sister, you know, came to the gallery and she brought the slides, and I saw, wow, how deeply she went into works, how ferociously she explored an idea, and how many things were related to each other and to the time. I was totally, you know, I was totally floored. And it also kind of flipped my whole idea of image making, of her contribution, and of what people thought about her at that time, which was totally a narrow view. And that's, I think, what all the retrospectives, Traces, Olga Viso's, you know, first.
Mendieta, yeah.
The New Museum, which was the one I saw in '87. Each show gives us something more or something that wasn't before, you know, ending with the last one, Covered in Time and History, which was organized by Howard Aransky and the Catherine Nash Gallery in Minnesota, but did its marvelous tour, which João, you saw in its glory moment at the Jeu de Paume, which was a really amazing moment for all of us.
Yeah, this is, of course, the most satisfying, I'm sure, for you both, but also as a curator, if someone really uses your research to deepen even more and more people come up, and more memories, more histories, more works even in collections you were not aware of. I think that's very gratifying to have this. Yeah. I think we could maybe continue on what they share and what makes them different. I think it's also with Anna there's something also they share, because we have these other projects still, the Schneemann Chapel in Asti in Italy, about these Cycladic imprints. But Anna Mendieta she started also prehistorical art, right? And she understood herself. I looked up, she really used the term Neolithical artist. She's a Neolithical artist. Is this right, Mary? Do you know about this?
I think she looked at all kinds of art history and art histories all over the world.
Yeah. But she was particularly very interested in ancient prehistoric history. That's why she traveled to Mexico, to Yucatan, and
other places, Malta.
Yes.
She really, I would say, she grabbed information and images wherever she could, wherever they fed her, and she used everything. And again, goes back to that idea of synthesis.
Yeah, so this interest in the history of the woman, the historical representation, that's something she shares with Carolee, but Carolee was more paying attention to the really sort of history of feminism. So the feminists, so the role of the women as such in society, not just as a, well, there are a lot of things, I don't know. Wendy, what do you think?
She was really, like, I think there was recently a discovery that the Paleolithic cave paintings were made by women. Like Carolee loved that. And a lot of her works are about the vulvic form through ancient history to contemporary representations, from contraptions like umbrellas, or Venuses from ancient times. So I think there's a similarity. Carolee lived longer, had more complexities in terms of feminism and seeing what happened in the world. And Carolee's work, again, we're kind of still talking about the same pieces of Carolee. Like the show Mary and I did together, Evidence A and B, was work from the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And I still think that work, and it needs to be explored, because, like, for example, Plague Column that she did, which was a column in Vienna, I think, which was about the bubonic plague, because I was like thinking about that when thinking about today, and the show Mary and the first show Mary and I did with Carolee represents the war on the plague and the image of a woman as a witch on this plague column. And it's, they described the solving or the curing of the plague as subduing the witch or killing the woman. And so thinking about now, and Carolee was also talking about the war on cancer at the time because of her own diagnosis, but then thinking about that, now, and this is what makes art great. And I think that's what Mary was saying about people finding Anna's work so fresh and new. Now, when you look at Carolee's work and the war on COVID, or when in fact it's a war on erasure of a lot of different communities in all over the world. So you can extrapolate the piece about the plague that Carolee did to what's happening now. So that's just one example of, and also the piece Mary had in her gallery called Precarious, which had images of cats caged in China for food, or images of prisoners dancing in these like regulated prisons, and her dancing and the cockatoo. But there are all these menacing images of historical images of confinement. And it's so relative to what's going on now. So Carolee left us like apart from Meat Body and apart Meat Joy and I Body, and up to including Her Limits, like a very deep, we have opportunity for a lot of deep dives into her politics that came up throughout her life. So
there are works
that women are still being thought of as two works of art.
Yeah. What I thought, what's really what Carolee, there's something Carolee has what I never saw in Anna, but she's really highly influenced by music, because her
We love
work
music.
is Cajun, but also she has a lot of music components, like in Fur Wheel, for instance, but of course in many other works, music plays scenes
Well,
of
because of
yeah, with Tenny, but in general, this was sort of the scene she was in, the art scene of her time, Judson Church and
Right.
all these happening groups of people. So, but that's, I mean, one could look only about the role of music in Carolee's work at some point. I think she told me she usually listened to music. Also, when she did her early paintings, she would have Bach playing, and a lot of works have titles according to music also. So she's, and I never saw this in Anna, so this is something very particular with Carolee. I think these music components, also using musical components in her work, I think.
well, noise bodies, a lot of performances, and make her own instruments, the noise of sculptures.
Yeah. So that's something
It's
where.
another
And then there was this role or question of feminism, right, João? You were asking, right, whether Anna Mendieta didn't also want to be assigned to being a feminist artist, right?
Yeah, I think I can gather two questions in one.
Yeah.
So basically, I watched an interview in which Carolee said that feminist art is a response to oppression, denigration, and marginalization of art made by women in the past 1,000 years. And I thought this was a particularly interesting statement. So I would like to hear, it was meant to be to Sabine, but I guess.
Well, we have two female women art dealers here. Can sing their own song.
There are no better people to reply to this question.
I didn't hear the first part of the quote.
Okay, I will repeat. Carolee said, feminist art is a response to oppression, denigration, and marginalization of art made by women in the past 1,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always very, you can categorize things. Like, for example, I never say I work with Latin American artists. I work with artists from Latin America or from Brazil. So I don't know that you can categorize feminist art. There is, of course, and research on that. But I think that both artists were very strong individuals, and they had to both come up in a hard way. And women artists are still coming up in a hard way, and there's still a lot of prejudice against women artists, and valuation or devaluation. Even if a number of women have gotten, quite a lot of attention, and there are so many women art dealers and all of that, it's still a very, I think, difficult time for women. And I think they had their own relations to how that affected their artwork, how they maneuvered through the world to be present, because I think for both of them, they were both fiercely ambitious, right? Mm-hmm. And they wanted their work to be seen any way you could, right? So if one label or another might have been helpful, I think they would have maybe worn it. But in particular, Anna was part of AIR, the Artisan in Residence, which, with Nancy Sparrow, who was avowedly a feminist artist, and others. But she also had some disillusionment with later on, because she felt that the feminist movement was not particularly aware of women of color. And this, of course, Wendy, were you in WAC? Women's Art Coalition? I mean, that kind of broke up another, like an American US-based feminist group in the, I think it was the 90s. That issue of like how many issues are seen is still a big, it's still a big problem today, with women.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that Carolee suffered a lot of censorship from feminists, although she was a feminist. and other artists too, like Betty Tompkins, for example. There's like, everyone knows here, and I'm sure there's different fractions. I think it's changed. I think those barriers have broken down, but in Carolee's lifetime in the 60s and 70s, and really in the 80s, I think it was really in the 90s when that started to change for Carolee, and younger women artists started embracing her. And like Sarah Lucas, like Sabine mentioned, and Tracy Emin and other artists started owning their own sexuality and really de-eroticizing their own bodies. Like Carolee never wanted to be the erotic object, but she wanted to use her body as something to make art with. But she was really denigrated, I would say. But she didn't. I don't think it broke her spirit or other artists. But I think it's an interesting thing to realize about Carolee. That, and then when I was also, it took me a long time as someone younger than her to, even when I saw the new museum show, to really understand, to dig deeper and understand what she was doing and not just flaunting her body. I think that's another problem that confounds us still today, and women owning their bodies. And I think Carolee, at one point later in her life, in a lot of lectures, women would come up and tell her they were naked and doing different performances and actions with their body. And she'd say, oh, stop it already. Just, there's so many other things going on. Do work about climate change, or do work about war, or do, you know. But I think there's interesting to remember that Carolee is an art and feminist, but also had to really persevere. She like tenaciously persevere with what she knew was true. I mean, that's the beauty of Carolee. Like in her whole, all her art making, she was trying to create a female iconography that she could give to the next generation of women that had, going maybe back to what you were saying about art history, that wasn't seen at all in previous art history, because women were painting the dreams of men still, rather than the dreams of women. So, and try to not mediate our dreams, dreaming, you know, like what we inherit, and then not to, she just like wanted like the Venus vocabulary to give us a new language. And that was, I think, a driving goal of Carolee's. And her feminist viewpoint, which was different than.
Yeah, if I may say so, I agree, if I may say something, but I think if you think about interior scroll, I think these two different texts, the two performances, she performed it twice. I mean, this is an explicit feminist work about the neglection, the acknowledgement of even that people look at your work. I think there are really some very strong works where Carolee really, you know, these are really feminist works, where she was really, the work was really about the lack of acknowledgement of, in that case, her work or others.
But a female filmmaker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Filmists don't understand either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she had this, she was she's beautiful. She was beautiful, always was. And I think this, a lot of women didn't like to see that. I mean, that was a lot of objections I heard when I told people I'm going to work with Carolee. Oh, she was so beautiful. So this kind of things. While on the other hand, Anna Mendieta, she incorporated, I think here the sort of negative response was, this was the exotic representation of an exotic body, right? Exotic female body.
Well, I remember, João, you didn't know her, but there was a really legendary museum director, Marcia Tucker, who did the show of Anna's at the New Museum, and others, probably Carolee's too. When
Dan Hammer curated it.
That was then.
Marcia
Tucker. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
So yeah. Marcia said to me, she was speaking of one of Anna's works where she has glass on her face and really distorts her body. And she said, it means it's such a powerful, and again, it's that idea of beauty. When a beautiful woman distorts herself in order to make a great image, like that is courage. Though that's only one work of Anna's, and the majority of her works were in nature. But one thing I feel a little guilty about is this was Carolee's. I mean, Carolee spoke about this in our very last meeting, when we had installed her show at the art dealers, was the last show that, you know, she was alive for, and we were going to go up, and she was feeling very ill. And she kind of chided me and said, you know, you have feminist artists, and, you know, you should put me in a show with feminist artists. But we never asked Anna, right? We never asked Anna if this was a comparison or something that she felt, and we can't really ask her. So, but one of the reasons when Wendy and I started talking about this show was the experiments both of them did with film, which were very early. As you said earlier, Sabine, the structural like infuses that Carolee did and that Anna did, you know, and part of how we got to see all these films was the amazing restoration that Raquel Cecilia Mendieta, Anna's niece, did. A great work of love, a great work of patience that was all done for Covered in Time, or as a result of Covered in Time, and gave, you know, us, you know, it was like opening a book that you've read before, and suddenly the book, you didn't realize it has 500 more pages. You know, and that's really, that was Raquel's work. And, you know, I'm really grateful that she was able to do that and worked on it so ferociously as her aunt made the images, I think. There are all kinds of film, and that's what I want in people to know about Anna, is how inventive she was. You know, that her work is remembered not because of her beauty, not because of her biography, not because of her terrible death, but because of the inventions and the doors she opened in art history that weren't there before, which all kinds of artists and all kinds of young artists are like flinging open and taking part of. And for Carolee too. Carolee, Wendy, tell everyone about the books Carolee kept of the
What books did she keep?
her scrapbook, Sabina, that Jenny
yes, of course,
yeah.
Yeah,
she
they're
would
gorgeous. Yeah, they're gorgeous.
She'd tear out of magazines, you know, images of people like was it Lady Gaga in a meat dress, and all these like random and some specific copies of her work, and all her works. And she kept very informal, very amusing loose leaf that has been made into a book, actually. Yeah, I mean, pervasive inspirations, both of them. And I think the struggle they both had at the time, you have to like cast your mind back to that. I mean, sexism was nothing. I just read Nancy Printenthal's book that Anna's in, and it's just a horrific reminder of the type of sexism that, you know, and Carolee was almost kicked out of Bard for painting a nude male. It's just, and that's rather, you know, a banal example of the kind of sexism they faced in every turn they made. So the bravery, both of them, I think, and creating new languages is inspiring.
I'd say how stubborn an artist, a woman artist, must be to be able to, you know, not give up and keep going doing work. I mean, beyond all, you know, things against you. I mean, in particular, Anna, I think also with sort of her background coming from Cuba, and was, I'm sure, very hard. Yeah. I don't know so much about their encounter, to be honest. I know they were both in Air Gallery and shown, but I know, of course, that Anna meant a lot to Carolee, but I don't know during the life of Anna how much encounter there was between the two of them, actually. Mary?
We think, I mean, I don't know, Carolee wrote, and actually, I don't remember, I'm pretty sure Sarah's online and she can remind us of this, but Carolee wrote that she knew Anna in the 60s, but that was impossible because Anna didn't come to New York till 78. I feel like the connection must have been Nancy Sparrow because they both knew Nancy, but Carolee doesn't appear in Anna's.
We looked for photographs of them together. We only had.
So it's a Carolee idea that we are presenting without really, and I think there's lots of things to explore in both of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's no evidence that they were close friends. Carolee was not an AI. She was not an AI. And but Anna was at the same time that Nancy Spera was, and others.
Anna in particular became an icon for women artists. I mean, I also know from Ballet Expert, and so also, of course, because of her early death under these very tragic circumstances. I think she became sort of a symbol of the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of worship as a woman artist, I think. And yeah.
Something I've spent 20 years fighting against.
Sorry. Yeah, but I know, but yeah.
But
yeah.
I have a question for both Wendy and Mary, if you can speak a little more about co-representing the state of Carolee.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, so we represent
quite enough within the art world as well, especially been to New York galleries. So
yeah, I think Lelong and PPOW have a unique relationship with Carolee that I like to think of as a model for future galleries, because 2 galleries is very unusual in the same city with 1 artist. So I like to think of it as a model of cooperation that's possible, that I don't see that often. And it came about because Carolee's legacy was really needed a bigger platform, and Mary, because the scope of her gallery and the scope of our gallery are very different. We have very different audiences, and we have, of course, overlaps, but there was enough differences to make sense that we could lift Carolee. You know, we felt compassionately about her having a global reach, a bigger platform, and because of the show Sabine was doing and other major books happening, and we wanted Carolee. Also, our space isn't that big, and Carolee has big projects, and we just felt like we could both we could work together, you know, to help Carolee's profile be expanded, which deservedly, you know, was something deserved.
And I think it's
Carolee, us again, of Anna, and Nancy, really, and all the other political artists, you know, also that Mary shows. We are very aligned in that way. Our respective trajectories have always been very political. So there was you know, you can't really show artists like this and then not be cooperative. It doesn't make any sense, and be feminists and not work together. So it's something that happened naturally, and it's been successful.
That's great.
And we were able to do this. I mean, I think this is like you know, and I just want to ask Mary that, and to the audience, that in this time when we're also isolated, but have the internet, the opportunity to do a show like this is fantastic. Because you know, galleries are pretty light on their feet, and we have great staff. And Mary mentioned Sarah and Landry, Eden Deering, and Annalise Beadnell really did this show. Mary and I were just like the supervisors, but we had like committed staff. I think we have enthusiastic, committed staff, people who love the work of these artists, who, you know, put their hearts into it now. So you can do these shows online. I think it's fascinating, and create a space and an idea and a conversation that you wouldn't have done 6 months ago. So
it's a positive thing about what happened, you know, about, you know, sort of the confinement, and the opportunity to, you know, as you say, move quickly. I mean, I think it's an idea one can explore more deeply. There's, you know, we saw so many things, and also we couldn't physically show, like if you showed fuses and films of Anna Mendieta, you know, it would be a beautiful dialogue. You can't really do that on the internet. There is still, of course, a missing sense of the physicality of both their works and the way they both use drawing. Both of them used drawing a lot. You could see of all of Mendieta's works as kind of self-portraits in a certain way, and the touch and her hand is very important. Like with Carolee, her drawings are beautiful.
Yeah, for a minute we thought to do a drawing show. Like that was one of our first ideas, to just do drawings of both of them. But it evolved into what it is. But it's just like a little. It's an idea that we could quickly do together, and thankfully we have great people working for us who can help us do it, and we feel it was a success. It was great.
Where does the title come from?
It's a quote of Anna's. It's a fragment of a quote.
It's a fragment. Wow. It's very well applied. It's great for what the show is. So Wendy, I will make the same question to Mary because I think that's particularly interesting for the public to know. I was wondering if you can speak about your first encounter with Carolee and Carolee's work, and how did you start working together more than 20 years ago?
Well, I had seen the new museum show, and of course, everyone knew Carolee and Carolee's work from, again, these famous earlier performances. They were sort of like in everyone's background, of everyone's mind. But I had heard from many people kept saying to me, you should show Carolee, you and Penny should show Carolee. And I finally, very good friends and collectors said, you should show Carolee. And they're Steve Johnson and Walt Studall, if they're listening, if they're here. And the three of us on a rainy night went to Carolee's studio in the 20s.
20 like 5th Street, I think it was, or 26th.
Sabine, do you remember the exact address?
I think it was 25th or 26th.
It's 29th, I think.
29th?
If anyone knows. Anyway, so we went, and Carolee's loft, it was an important site, and I'm glad I saw it because she sold it quite a few years after that, and then moved permanently upstate. But it was where a lot of her early works, like Meat Body, iBody, were made, and it was in a furrier loft, and it was fascinating to go there and meet her. And rain was coming through the ceiling window, and it had a feeling like our house has. There's a certain ambiance to Carolee's physicality of her own and her environments. And then I think Stephen Walt bought a drawing. We hopped in a cab, and the thing I remember the most about there was how cabs have, cabs have these little air Christmas trees, and she opening the window and was saying it was very carcinogenic, and we shouldn't breathe the air of that. And we went off to a party, and that was the first time I met her. And I have to say we had a lot of experience, professional and social. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about her personality, but it took a long time to learn about her work, honestly. The gift of Sabina's show and giving that to everyone, including the gallery, an opportunity to delve into 50 years of work. It's hard to do that when you meet an artist late in their career. It's a lot of learning. And Carolee, she became more diminished as I knew her, I guess, because she was increasingly ill. But we were with her, Mary and Sabina, when she got the Golden Lion in Venice, and that was quite a triumph. And she wasn't in the Venice Biennale ever, but she did get the Golden Lion.
Well, up to including Limits was shown at the Venice Biennale,
but not in the.
Of course not.
It was in performances by Rauschenberg and was in Venice when he got it. So for her, it was and she was very ill, and she went. She persevered and actually went there to accept the award.
It was a tough trip for her.
Very tough.
It was a tough trip.
And in particular, then she went to Frankfurt. We hanged out in Frankfurt.
Yes.
It was a long...
Which I think was opening more or less now, Sabina.
Actually, that's why I got this image of her eating dessert in front of me all these evenings we spent there. Yeah, because she came directly from Venice, and she was really exhausted, I must say. It was quite an effort, but it was really a great privilege. She joined the tour even. In Frankfurt, of course, New York. That was sort of her home.
That was great for her to be celebrated.
Yes, absolutely.
In her home. That was a great.
Yeah, and I was very happy it worked out. It took long. As you know, Wendy, I tried so hard to find partners from the beginning. This was crazy. Lots of, and at the end, people had to see the show because they couldn't believe, right? And I mean, and it was a lot of work thanks to the gallery. Wendy, of course, supported that. But I mean, of course, a lot of works were, we not only had to find them, we had to restore them, we had to, document them, we had to find out what it really was about. and Carolee, I mean, that's how I started, when I found this version of Up to Including Limits, we were
Right.
for a moment. She said, "Oh, don't even look at it, it's crap." I said, "No, I want to see it." And so she was so funny. Yeah, I mean, it's something she refused because she had some bad memories, so she didn't want to look at it again. It's like, yeah. No, I mean, this was fantastic that we were able to do it. Thank you, Wendy.
That's great. Yes.
For your staff, Annelies, and of course Brandon. It was great to have Brandon on board to have someone. Yeah, no, this was, and yeah, it was hard work for Carolee in her condition. Yeah, of course.
But again, I think it points out, like, being a female artist, even of her importance, taught in every university all over the world, written about endlessly in, everything from serious academic journals to pop magazines.
Yeah.
Sabine and Mary and PPOW tried very hard to travel the show, and then it only traveled once it was open and curators came and saw it, and then it went to Frankfurt and went to PS1. But
thank God Stuart was at the opening, remember?
Thank
God he was at the opening.
Yeah, absolutely.
In Vienna.
So,
yeah.
a labor that,
and it was a huge success, and a lot of people saw it in Frankfurt because it coincided with Documenta, so a lot of people saw it there. Yeah, but also Salzburg. I mean, we got enormous press and huge audiences. I mean, lots of people came just for the show. Yeah, but it was a hard time for Carolee because I think it was more or less, as you know, there were some difficult moments when I was installing, and I, presented her everything, every detail, the color I selected for the wall and everything. And she came to Salzburg and she thought she can just do it like she always did it. And I had to tell her, Carolee, let's try it this time how I've envisioned it and how I presented it. And next time you can do it again like you. But it was hard. But the next tours, the next venues worked easily. She didn't even look at it, what I did anymore. No, not at all. She just came to celebrate. Yeah. But I learned, I mean, it's sometimes women of this generation, I'm often asked, are you the curator, you working with these difficult women artists? I said, no. The women artists, it's true, I'm working a lot with the women artists from that generation, but not the women are difficult. Their environment, their circumstances were really difficult and challenging, and that's why it's very hard for them, to let it go, to collaborate again with someone, to unpack all these works, because they also unpack bad memories.
that's true.
Sabine, I have, this was one of my very first questions to you. I've seen that throughout your career, you have, exactly as you said, worked with many women artists. So I wanted to hear if this was more accidental and it happened because it happened, or there's a sort of political intention on it, and if you can tell a little more about filling gaps in the art history with these true pioneers.
Let's put it like that. I also worked with male artists who were underrated a lot, like someone like Gustav Metzger, who has also an exile history, who exiled from Nazi Germany with 12 years to England, by the way. So I would say my specialty or my interest, it's an interest. As a curator, I like to contribute something which is not there yet, because why should I do shows? I mean, I'm not a Picasso expert, there are other people, and there's so much done already, or Cézanne, rather Cézanne, in terms of Carolee Schneemann, how she would put it. No, I think my work is a lot of work organizing a show like that. I don't need to tell you, particularly not Wendy and Mary. It's a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of, unsecure situation financially, logistic-wise, and whatever. So if I want to put this effort, I want to be meaningful, and I want to really contribute something something which is new, where you really offer a new sort of oeuvre for people in an extent, in a way people have not had the chance to see it before. I mean, that's why I'm doing it, because and so you end up naturally, because the art world was not very much aware, and still is not aware of a lot of women artists. So naturally you end up working with a lot of women artists, of course. And of course I'm a woman, so it's it's of course it's not an accident. I mean, I think that's a political program, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Interesting. So
and I'm always glad to hear if it's really meaningful, and if it really helped putting some on stage in a way, the person, whether it's a male artist or a woman artist, in a way it was not the same before, of course. And it's also interest. I need to be curious. I'm a curious person, so I need to, I mean, this was in particular great with Carolee, because the works were there. You had to manage to open the boxes, to find the pieces together. It's like a little detective story you're doing. And yeah, but it's I'm very grateful if in the case of Carolee in particular, an artist give me access, is trustful to let me, you know, look into the works and showing the works. Because again, as I mentioned before, it's not that they are often in that age, in that phase of life, a lot of artists are not really waiting anymore. They want to do new work rather. You know, this is something I often encounter. They don't. I remember I also worked with Simone Forti and gave her the first large retrospective, also in Salzburg, and worked with her already at the Modern before, of course, but the big thing I did in Salzburg. And she always told me, you know, I'd rather make Tai Chi. I don't want to get into this. And in one afternoon, she thought she's finished. I said, no, I come back tomorrow, we just started. So to convince an artist in a certain age to really dive into her work, into her history, is not something where you really need to motivate the artist that she's really ready to do it, because often they're not ready anymore, to be honest. Yeah. Carolee was really, I mean, actually Carolee I met, and this is really true, it's not a story I made up when I spoke at her memorial. She was kind of, at least she said, she always wanted to work with me, and she always had this idea, we are going to work together. I mean, always when I met her coincidentally in New York, say, if you can't come this time, but I'm sure we're going to work together. And when I started to work at MoMA, I called up and said, so here I am, let's talk. And it was a huge pleasure, because I looked up what they have in the collection. There was one work, basically, more or less, very few works, not the most important works. And it's beautiful. I mean, if the whole wealth of an artist's work is still there, I mean, to do the show of Carolee now, and I know how difficult it is with Anna Mendieta, because a lot of works are in collections, of course, it becomes complicated, can become expensive once the museum, the big major museums, realize that they have to get some works. I mean, a lot of shows I did, I wouldn't be able to do anymore today, at least not with the same budget, or not in this sort of time frame also. I mean, yeah, so you have also to see your chances and do it in the right moment. Yeah. And there's always the show after your show, which is even more, you know, dives even more deeper into research, because it adds up. That's why it's very important to publish good books. So in case of Carolee particularly, we hired a research assistant. In addition, Catherine Daman, who because it's difficult from Europe, you know, to go to the Getty all time. And so you have to hire people in addition. And with Tracy's Anna Mendieta, we had luckily Stephanie often went to, right? I remember I was still in New York and she started to work on the show and we talked about it. And then we were going to move to Salzburg, and it was actually my first show in my program, Anna Mendieta. It was fantastic. And it was beautiful. I'm very proud we did it. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
That leads
So-
me to a question for Mary, who has not only worked with various estates, but with great female artists. I wanted to hear more about your first encounter with Ana Mendieta's work, and how did you start working together, and how it was throughout the years since her museum recognition, her institutional recognition came much later than it was due.
Yes, though well, I didn't know Anna, right? She was already deceased. I saw the New Museum show in 1987, made a huge impression on me. I wasn't in a position of leadership to do anything. I had a more minor job at a gallery. And then...
We're very glad you are now, very glad.
And when I became the director of Lelong in 91, I happened to walk by a small gallery on 57th Street that had an invitation in the window, and it said, you know, Ana Mendieta, Carlo Lamagna Gallery. And I went to see the exhibition, and when I think of this, I think this is why Carlo became a professor and was not a dealer, because I looked at the work. It was not that expensive at the time, and I wanted to buy something. He was showing me works, and I couldn't decide. And he said, you know what, I'm getting, this is like what you should never do when you're an art dealer. He said, I'm getting more works in a few weeks or a month from the family from Iowa, so why don't you wait and come back then? So I left, and some time went by, and I went back to the gallery, and the gallery was closed. So, and then Carlos actually later became my thesis advisor at NYU, but that's a side story. So I wrote to the New Museum, and I said, can I get in touch with the family of Ana Mendieta? And since it was a very different time in the art world and things were more open, they said, sure. And they sent me Raqueline's address in Chestnut Ridge, New York. And I wrote to her because we didn't have internet. And I was sitting at my desk, and the gallery assistant said, your sister's here. And I said, oh, and I was kind of surprised because my sister was a lawyer and worked downtown. And I go into the gallery, and Raqueline was laughing because it wasn't my sister, but we looked really alike at that time. And we just had a kind of almost instant rapport. And I would say, which is carried through, I mean, I'm very close to the family and now Raqueline's, during the process of working on traces, Raqueline became quite ill, and her daughter, Raquel Cecilia, has, taken over all the day-to-day work and the work in the exhibitions, and we're very close. So it's a very familial relationship in one way, but we're all, I think, united, not just because we love each other, but because we love Ana, and we believe in Ana, and we want to put Ana first. And the first work I actually did sell was to a museum, which was amazing. The body tracks are in the Rose Art Museum. The second work was to the Dela Cruz collection, which is now a museum. But then it took a really long time to get people to appreciate the work. And one of the kind of worst moments I had was when I offered her sculpture to an important museum, and they said, it's not very interesting tribal art. But, things come around. I never, ever doubted that she was a great artist, never. So I think that when you are really sure, and I think Carolee believed she was a great artist, and Ana believed she was a great artist. And I think if you have that confidence, and there's something there are people who have the confidence, but there isn't enough there. But in both of their cases, there's a huge amount there. Eventually, the world listens. And that's, what happened. And we've had so many joyful experiences. Working with Olga Visu was a wonderful, it was just like I learned she learned, we all learned, like every time we do a show, we all learn. And so for me, it's like an endless, I don't know, it's like an endless open book that you keep finding new things. I don't know Carolee's work as well as Wendy does. I'm still learning. So I'm less sure sometimes of what to choose. But with Anna, I feel very like confident that I understand the body of work.
So it's then 30 years nearly you're working with Anna.
Yeah, she was the first, when I became director in the nadir of the .com recession with, you know, no money and no artists. Like, that's why I have a very different opinion about now. I mean, I've been through many bad times in the art world. She was the first artist I brought to the gallery, and in many ways, her work and then all the artists I met through her really gave the direction, you know, for me as a beginning, as, you know, a really young director.
I don't know, João, if you see there are a few questions. I'm not so familiar with Zoom and these question format, but there are some.
So, yes,
some people want to see images, and then Gail Elston joined, actually. This is the collector I'm working on, the Carolee Schneemann Chapel. She asked if we differentiate these two artists in respect to their political commentaries. Wendy, maybe you wanna. Now I'm playing the moderator.
Go on. Yeah,
I'm taking over the moderator role. Gail Elston is asking in terms of the political commentaries of both artists. I mean,
I think we know speak to that before. Did Gail just join? Because we spoke to that.
She wrote a comment or a question. Yeah.
Because we spoke about that when I was disease and politics.
Lebanon was,
He's worked for 30 more years than Anna did. It's but her.
But did Anna make direct political commentaries in her work? Not that I know, right? Did Anna do warm up and things like that? But with Anna, I don't know. Mary, did Anna do something?
She was engaged. I think she was. I think her whole experience as a Cuban American, you know, she had a very complex political identity as well. Returning to Cuba, bringing people. I'm not sure I really understand the question well enough to answer that I can give a cogent answer. But she was. I mean, I don't know if she went to. I'm trying to. Well, she did the exhibition Dialectics of Isolation, which was with a group of artists of color. I mean, I think that was a political statement. She was involved in heresies.
That's right.
She was part of the Cuban, you know, she brought Lucy Lepard to Cuba. I'm not sure if Martha Rossler was part of her group or went independently, but she brought a lot of politically engaged people. And she was a great bridge between Cuban artists in Cuba and the United States, which I think she is underrepresentedly known for making that bridge.
Okay.
So I've read most of the questions, and I think we have covered pretty much all of them. There's just one particular one which I think is worth going through, which is coming a little back there when we spoke about beauty. Regarding this question around beauty, I'm thinking more widely also of Hannah Wilke, who also worked with the body and transformation through illness at the end. Would you like to comment a bit about Hannah?
About Hannah Wilke? Well, there are a number of artists who worked with the representation of the beauty, the female body as a beauty, as an object of beauty, of course. Is quite different. I mean, there's this accusation. I think it's very hard being a beautiful woman. It sounds odd, but can be very hard. In particular, if you use your image, if you use your body, you always accuse you doing it because you want to demonstrate being so beautiful. I was understood from Carolee in particular, she understood this and she was operating with this consciously. She used it. she understood that's a weapon rather than a burden.
Yes,
This discussion goes
And
around.
Hannah Wilke too. I mean, she had, and Hannah Wilke exposed, you know, when she was not so beautiful anymore, after cancer treatment and mastectomy, and so of course, so this is a whole lineage of the transformation of what a female body can look like, and.
But Carolee was, you know, I mean, Carolee could have chosen, I mean, the plague column, don't you think, Wendy, refers to her own cancer as well as the idea, but she was much less, I would say, she was much more private about her own travails with her body than, as I understand, Hannah Wilke was, who used that experience of transformation. You know, to talk about probably even the politicization of, you know, the treatment of women with cancer. I mean, those are really tough works, but I think what all three artists have in common is using beauty and using the body in order to make a strong gesture and a new form. I mean, that could be a show too. You know, Anna, Hannah, and Carolee. That could be a great trilogy.
I'm gonna defer to object to that a little, Mary, in that I think like the fact that we are like, and I brought it up before because Carolee was dismissed by the feminists and because of her beauty. Mm-hmm. But if we could get to a goal in life where we're not discussing what a woman looks like, that would be a really big, in a general way, just focusing on the work and not even thinking about whether they're fat or thin or young or old or whatever, because we don't do that with men. So we don't say, wow, Nauman was so hot in those videos. We just so we need to get to a point.
So perfect.
Which he was.
Indeed.
Where it's not really what we're focusing on or even thinking about it. You know, I did bring it up, so I'm not saying that I don't think that way, but that's my feeling about Hannah or Anna or Carolee or, you know, whoever's coming up or whoever in the past.
It's about the work. So I mean, we were meant to be here for an hour, and the discussion was so engaging and pleasant. We added half an hour more.
João, muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, João. Yes. And good luck to Brazil.
Yes.
We're all praying for Brazil. We love Brazil. Actually, Wendy, Sabine, and I have all been in Brazil together for the São Paulo biennial a few years ago. We were all together.
Yeah. And it was supposed to be this year, wasn't it? Again,
it was canceled. Then they are reshaping. I mean, everything else. It's been, the format has been discussed.
But thank you.
No, not only Anna and Carolee are very inspiring women. So the three of you are. So it's a pleasure.
Thank you for staying up so late.
Thank you
for asking me, and take care of yourself, please. The numbers are going down, right, in New York now again.
Yeah. Thank you.
And survive. You have to keep going with your work. Yeah, we will.
We are. No problem. No problem with that.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Enjoy the evening. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the audience.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.